George Henderson never liked the women of the small town. They always gathered in front of the local convenience store, whispering, laughing, pointing fingers like they had nothing else to do. No gardens to tend, no families to take care of, just endless gossip. When he was offered a job as a forest ranger and the chance to live in a small cabin deep in the woods, George didn't hesitate. He was glad, no, relieved. Life alone didn't scare him. It felt like freedom. But the women didn't like that. They whispered even more. Why is he alone? Why doesn't he have a wife? The truth was, he once had everything. A wife, a son, a future. Back then he wasn't Henderson. He was just Mark. Mark had been deeply in love with Emily, his childhood sweetheart. He carried her in his arms, promised her the world, and when the army drafted him, he swore he would come back and marry her. Emily waited. She wrote letters. She kept his picture under her pillow. When Mark finally returned home from service, he rushed straight to her, his heart pounding. They wasted no time filed for marriage, and within weeks they had a wedding. Mark had a temper, sure. Everyone in town knew he was quick to anger. But Emily wasn't afraid of him. She teased him, calmed him, and maybe that was why he loved her so fiercely. When Emily gave birth to their son prematurely, at 7 months, Mark had dark thoughts. Was the baby really his? But he shoved them aside. Emily could never betray him. At least that's what he believed, until his so-called best friend whispered poison into his ear. It was one of those nights. Emily had just come home with the baby. Mark was tired after laying the foundation for their new backyard shed. He sat in his garage with a bottle of whiskey when Nick, his old buddy, walked in. Emily hated Nick. She never wanted him around. Mark knew it, but tonight he didn't care. He poured drinks and they sat together. Nick smirked. So how does it feel, being a dad? Mark shrugged. I don't know yet. He's small, doesn't even understand anything. Nick leaned back in his chair. Yeah, babies are sweet. Doesn't matter if they're yours or someone else's. Mark froze. His hand gripped the bottle tighter. What's that supposed to mean? Nick lifted his hands innocently. I'm just saying what everyone knows. Emily wasn't exactly loyal while you were gone. The air turned heavy. Mark's voice dropped, low and dangerous. Say it straight, Nick, or I'll shut you up myself. Nick backed toward the door, smirking but keeping his distance. I didn't see it myself, but the whole town knows. People saw her sneaking home at dawn more than once. You really think that kid's yours? Don't be a fool. Raise another man's baby if you want, but don't say I didn't warn you. With that, Nick slipped out into the night, and Mark sat there, his world collapsing around him. They had moved into Mark's family house after the wedding. His parents had died before he left for the army, leaving him the home. Emily had been an orphan, raised by her aunt in a neighboring town. Together they rebuilt the place, planted flowers, made it theirs. Mark had dreamed of more children, a daughter one day. But now that dream curdled into anger. He drank until dawn. His head pounded, his stomach turned, but his rage burned stronger than any hangover. By morning, when the village women led their cows to pasture, Mark staggered to the old chest in his garage. He pulled out his father's shotgun, loaded, ready. The women stopped in their tracks as he walked toward the house, gun in hand. Whispers spread like fire. Within minutes, a crowd gathered at his gate. Mark stormed into the bedroom. Emily was still asleep, the baby in a cradle beside her. He jabbed her shoulder with the barrel. Get up. Emily blinked, then sat up calmly, shielding the baby with her arm. Mark, you're drunk. Please, go back to bed. No more lies. His voice was gravel. Get dressed. Take your bastard and leave my house. Her eyes widened. Bastard, that's your son. Mark's jaw tightened. He's not mine. People told me the truth. You cheated on me, Emily. Emily's lips trembled, but her voice was steady. Let me guess. Nick, your precious friend? Then I know exactly what this is about. But he wouldn't listen. Get out now, he growled, or you'll walk out naked. With trembling hands, Emily wrapped the baby in a blanket, shoved diapers and a bottle into a bag, and held him close. Out, Mark barked. She opened the door only to see half the town standing outside, staring. She wanted to step back inside, but the cold steel pressed against her back. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, Mark, stop this madness. He turned and fired a shot into the ground. The crowd scattered. The baby wailed. Emily walked faster, head held high, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Mark followed her to the edge of the town. There he stopped, his voice cut like a knife. "If I ever see you here again, I'll kill you." And then he turned his back on her. Back inside, he collapsed across the couch, the shotgun clattering to the floor. Within seconds, he was unconscious. When he woke the next morning, his throat burned. "Emily, water." Silence. He turned. No wife, no child. The shotgun leaned against the wall. Memories of last night crashed back into his mind. For a week, he wandered like a ghost. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. And then, by chance, he found the baby's hospital papers. His hands trembled as he read. Premature birth, 7 months. The words stabbed his chest. Premature, not illegitimate. Nick had lied. Mark stormed out of the cabin that morning like a man possessed. His fists clenched around the papers, the ink smearing with sweat. Premature, he muttered again and again. 7 months, not another man's. The gossip that had poisoned his heart, every cruel word, every sideways glance, suddenly twisted into knives of guilt. His boots pounded the dirt road as he ran through the town. People stared from their porches. Some shook their heads, whispering, "He's drunk again." Others pulled their children closer. But Mark didn't care. He reached Nick's house. The yard was littered with beer cans. The front door sagged on its hinges. Mark shoved it open so hard it banged against the wall. Inside, Nick sat slumped at the table, a half-empty bottle in front of him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face bloated from weeks of drinking. Mark's voice was a growl. "Tell me again, Nick. Tell me who Emily cheated with." Nick smirked, though his lips trembled. "Why, you finally figured it out? Everyone knew but you. I just did you a favor." Mark slammed his fist on the table, rattling the bottle. "Don't lie to me now. Was it you?" Silence. Nick's mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale, eyes burning. "Enough, Mark." She turned on her son, voice sharp as glass. "Tell him the truth before I do." Nick looked away. His hands shook. His mother spat the words, "Emily never cheated on you. She was faithful even when you didn't deserve her. This fool," she pointed at Nick, "chased her, hounded her. And when she rejected him, when she hit him with a poker to drive him out, he spread lies. Lies that ruined her life." Mark's knees nearly buckled. The room spun. Nick muttered, voice high and broken, "I loved her. She should have been mine. She never looked at me the way she looked at you. You didn't deserve her." Mark didn't hear the rest. He was already running again, through the fields, across the dusty road, toward the neighboring town where Emily's aunt lived. His chest burned, but his guilt burned hotter. He reached the small white house, pounded on the door. The aunt opened it, her lips pressed tight. "Where is she?" Mark gasped. "Please, I need to see Emily." "I need to see my son." Her eyes narrowed. "Now you care? After what you did? After you humiliated her in front of everyone?" Mark fell to his knees on the porch. His voice cracked. "I was wrong. I believed lies. Please, I'll beg for her forgiveness every day of my life. Just tell me where she is." The aunt's eyes glistened, but her voice stayed hard. "She's gone. Packed up, left for the city. Maybe farther. She said she'd never come back." Then, with a trembling breath, she whispered, her last words were goodbye. Forever. And she closed the door in his face. The weeks that followed were torment. Mark searched the city, asked everyone, put up notes in bus stations and clinics. No one had seen Emily. No one had seen the baby. Back in town, the people treated him like a ghost. Conversations died when he walked into a room. Mothers pulled their children away from him. Every glance said the same thing. Monster. He drank less now. Drinking only made the guilt louder. Instead, he worked. He rebuilt fences, fixed roofs, chopped wood until his hands bled. But the silence in his home was unbearable. So when the Forestry Service offered him the ranger job alone in the mountains, away from the stairs, away from the whispers, he took it without hesitation. Years passed. Mark became Henderson to most, a gruff ranger who kept hunters in line and knew every inch of the forest. His hair grayed early. His face grew hard. But inside, the wound never healed. Every trip to town reminded him. The women still gossiped. They still watched him from the corner of their eyes. When he walked into the store, the chatter died. As soon as he left, it roared back louder than ever. He lived with it, or tried to. But sometimes late at night, staring at the fire in his cabin, he whispered her name. Emily, forgive me. The day came when his boss drove up in a dusty pickup truck. Got you some help for the summer, the man said, climbing out, a young guy from the city. Fresh out of college. He'll learn from you. Mark frowned. Hope he ain't soft. This ain't a job for soft men. He'll be fine. He walked the last 2 miles just to take in the woods. Said he wanted to see the land before driving in. That piqued Mark's interest. Maybe the kid wasn't so bad. Minutes later, a tall young man appeared from the trail, backpack slung over one shoulder. He was broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, with a quiet confidence. He walked up, extended his hand. Hi, I'm Andrew. Mark shook it, surprised by the strength of his grip. There was something about him, something familiar he couldn't place. They ate together that evening on the porch. Andrew spoke with energy about the forest, about conservation, about responsibility. He wasn't just another student looking for an easy summer. He cared, truly cared. Mark listened, nodded, even smiled, a rare thing. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. He didn't know it yet, but fate had just brought his past back to his doorstep. The first week with Andrew felt like teaching a wolf pup the trails, easy, instinctive. He rose before dawn, brewed coffee strong enough to chew, and was waiting by the cabin steps when Mark opened the door. No phone out, no headphones, no teenage slouch. Just bright eyes and a quiet, eager stillness, like he'd been listening to the forest wake. They started with the basics, boundary lines, old logging roads that hadn't seen a truck in 30 years, elk tracks versus mule deer, how to read a hillside by the way the grass leaned and the way the wind carried the smell of water. Andrew absorbed it all without pretending he already knew. He asked the right questions, then shut up and watched. Mark respected that. By noon, they'd cross a creek and climb a ridge where the pines thinned and the light came down like gold dust. Mark would kneel, pinch needles, point out beetle kill, and Andrew would mirror him, big hands careful as a surgeon's. On the second day, Mark handed him the field journal, his field journal like a test. Andrew didn't flinch. He wrote in neat square print, dating the entries at the top like he'd been born in a ranger station. Good hand, Mark said. My mom's a nurse, Andrew replied without looking up. She used to say if she couldn't read it, she'd throw it out. Mark grunted. He stared a second too long at the page, at the tidy letters marching in a line, and felt something odd and old tug under his ribs. They ate on the tailgate most days. Jerky, apples, thermos coffee gone lukewarm. Andrew talked when there was something to say about watersheds, about a professor who could name every native grass in 3 counties, about how silence in a city was different from silence in a forest. Mark found himself listening more than he meant to. You ever get used to the way the mountains smell after rain? Andrew asked one afternoon, thunder muttering far off. You don't get used to it, Mark said. You get ruined by it. Everything else smells wrong. Andrew smiled at that, really smiled, the kind that lifts the eyes, not just the mouth, and for a heartbeat, Mark saw someone else. A woman in sunlight, holding a child swaddled in a blue blanket. His stomach went tight, and he looked away, angry at ghosts. They hit town twice a week for supplies. The first time Andrew walked into the general store, the usual hush fell. Heads turned. The checker with the copper hair stopped mid-scan and watched Mark like a hawk sizing a rabbit. Andrew felt it. He didn't say a word, but his shoulders set. He kept close while Mark picked flour, beans, coffee, salt. At the counter, the checker bagged items with brittle efficiency. You got a new trainee, she said without looking up. Summer help, Mark said. She flicked her eyes to Andrew, then back to Mark. Let's hope he's better company than your shotgun. The room tightened. Somewhere in the back, a soda cooler hummed too loud. Andrew looked from her to Mark and back again, something like warning in his eyes. Mark set cash on the counter and said nothing. He was halfway to the door when the checker's voice softened. Mark, she said, not Mr. Henderson. We were younger. People said things. Some of us believed them, some of us didn't. A beat. Be careful out there. Outside, the sky was hard blue and the wind smelled of rain that might not come. Andrew waited until they were in the truck. Want me to drive? He asked. Mark grunted. I'm fine. They rode with the windows down. When Andrew finally spoke, he didn't ask what Mark expected. Sometimes small towns decide a story, he said. Then they just keep telling it, whether it happened or not. Mark's fingers tightened on the wheel. That a speech from your city professor? No. Andrew looked out at the sliding hills. From my mother. Mark felt the words hit like a nail tapped just right. He wanted to ask 100 questions. What town, what story, what mother? He swallowed them like stones. That night the clouds finally broke. Rain came heavy, loud on the cabin's tin roof, washing the dust from the needles and the old ache from Mark's bones. He lay awake and listened to it like a hymn, and below the rain he heard a smaller sound pages turning. Andrew reading at the table by the window, a headlamp haloing his hair. What is it? Mark asked from his bed in the corner. Fire behavior in mixed conifer, Andrew said, and, this. He held up something thin and dog-eared. Your old field map. Mark squinted. Where'd you get that? Bottom drawer. You said to learn the lines. Mark almost said those maps weren't for touching. Instead, he heard himself say, Careful with Edge B. She tears. Andrew returned a lopsided grin. Already taped it. He had neat strips, perfectly squared. The same patience Emily used to have with wrapping gifts corners tight enough to shave with. Mark shut his eyes against the thought. The morning after the rain, the forest smelled like green lightning. They walked a mile without speaking. At the creek crossing, Mark slipped on a slick rock, a rare misstep. He caught himself, but his knee tweaked and he sucked breath between his teeth. You okay? Andrew was at his side instantly, steadying him by the elbow. His grip was strong, but gentler than most men Mark's size ever managed. Fine, Mark snapped, more harsh than he meant. He pulled free, stepped to dry ground. A dull ache bloomed along the old scar he always told people was from barbed wire. It wasn't. Andrew pretended not to notice the bite in Mark's voice. He moved ahead, testing rocks, offering nothing but an easy rhythm to follow. When they stopped under a big ponderosa, Andrew crouched and started to roll up Mark's pant leg without asking, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Don't, Mark said. Andrew froze, hands in the air. Okay. They stared at each other longer than made sense for two men in the woods. Mark let out a breath. It's old, he said. Acts up when the weather swings. Andrew nodded. I was born early, he said, so casually it sounded like talking about baseball. Lungs were a mess for a while. Change in pressure used to knock me on my ass. Mom said the barometer ruled our house. Born early. The words slid under Mark's skin and set every nerve humming. He wanted to ask how early, which hospital, what doctor. He said nothing. The forest around them ticked and breathed. A raven called once, like a bell. Your mom, Mark said finally. She a nurse, you said. Yeah. She from around here? Far enough, Andrew said and smiled like he knew he wasn't answering. Close enough. They moved on. They found an illegal fire ring near a vista and dismantled it, scattering cold ash, packing out the beer cans. Andrew lined the stones in a tidy half-moon and scrubbed the soot off a log with a wet bandana until his hands were black. People think the woods are big, he said, breathless from effort. Big enough for their mess to disappear. They're wrong, Mark said. They're wrong, Andrew echoed. In the afternoons, Mark started calling him Kid, and sometimes when the sun was behind him and the wind pushed the smell of pines through the needles just so, sun. The first time it slipped out, Andrew didn't flinch. He just looked at Mark for a long second, something complicated and bright moving across his face, and said, Copy that, sir. They found a campsite trampled flat by a herd of elk and an old tree stand wired to a trunk, the bark grown around it like scar tissue. Mark taught Andrew how to spot a poacher's trail not by footprints. They were too careful for that, but by broken fern tips and the way a lower branch had been bent and left, A crude marker. Andrew learned fast. Faster than Mark wanted him to, maybe. Because the faster he learned, the faster Mark felt something like pride twist with fear. One evening, while the light turned sweet and long, they sat on the steps and cleaned their rifles. The forest softened into moths, and the soft note of a whip-poor-will. Andrew held up Mark's old shotgun, thumb brushing the worn spot on the stock where a man's grip had polished the wood to satin over decades. "This one's seen things," Andrew said. "Too many," Mark said. Andrew looked over, eyes thoughtful. "Can I ask you something, Mark?" "You can try. What made you take this job? Most people don't choose to be alone." Mark ran an oiled rag down the barrel. He could have said the forest did. He could have said the money, the freedom, the sky. He could have lied, the way he'd lied to himself for 20 years. He said nothing. Andrew nodded like that was an answer. He set the shotgun down gently, as if setting down a sleeping child. "Sometimes," he said, almost too quiet to hear, "being alone isn't a choice. It's a sentence." He stood and stretched. "See you at dawn." When the door closed, Mark sat with the gun across his knees and felt the old world press in. In his mind, Emily turned in sunlight again, that half smile he was sure he'd never deserved. He whispered to the empty trees, "I'm sorry," and the trees, like always, gave no reply. The radio crackled just after midnight. Static, then a voice flattened by distance and storm. "Shots reported. North boundary. Possible trespassers." Mark was already pulling on his boots. He grabbed the radio, answered with their call sign. "Copy, on our way." Andrew was out of his room before Mark reached the door, laces hanging, jacket half on. He didn't ask if he could come. He just came. They took the truck as far as the trailhead, then killed the lights and moved on foot. The moon was a thin coin behind the clouds, but the forest had a way of making its own light, silver and soft. Mark led, Andrew at his shoulder, each foot placed where the other had placed his, soundless as ghosts. A mile in, they found the first sign. Fresh tire ruts pressed into damp soil where no legal road ran. Beer can glitter, crushed flat. The air smelled wrong old smoke and cheap propellant. Mark held up a fist. "Stop." Andrew froze, eyes on Mark's hand, waiting. Voices floated through the trees, men too loud for midnight, not scared enough. A nervous laugh, then the distinctive clack of a bolt racking back. Andrew's breath hitched. Mark's hand found his shoulder, squeezed once, firm. The kid's pulse beat hard under Mark's fingers. For a heartbeat, Mark felt a fierce, bewildering surge of protectiveness that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with blood. He leaned close, lips near Andrew's ear. "On my mark," he whispered. "No heroics. We do this by the book." Andrew nodded, jaw set. Somewhere ahead, a round slid into a chamber with a sound that makes every man who's ever held a gun straighten his spine. Mark lifted 2 fingers. "Ready." He lowered them. "Move." And together, like a single shadow, they stepped into the dark between the pines. The voices were closer than they sounded. Sound traveled strange at night, skittering off trunks and slipping through boughs. Mark could smell the camp before he saw it. Cold grease, sour beer, and the sharp metallic tang of gun cleaner. A bad mix. Men who planned to stay, men who planned to shoot. He and Andrew ghosted through the understory, stepping where the soil was soft and the needles laid thick. Mark raised a palm and pointed. 2 figures by a tailgate, one on a log with a cigarette, a fourth in the shadows tinkering with a scope. No headlights, but the truck's dome light glowed dim amber every time someone grabbed a box from the cab. "Poachers," Andrew breathed, barely a sound. Mark's reply was a look. By the book, he tapped his radio twice silent signal, and it pulsed red, recording. He wanted dispatch to have the audio if anything went sideways. They split like water around a stone. Mark drifting left toward the truck, Andrew right, keeping the wind in their favor. The men laughed again too loud, too sure they were alone. One of them mimed a rifle kick with his shoulder and said, "She bucks hard, but she sings," and the others cackled like teenagers. Mark stepped out where the lantern's edge met the dark. "Evening, gentlemen." It was the kind of voice that ends parties. Four heads snapped his way. The one with the cigarette let it fall. The one at the scope swore and kicked a case under the tailgate. "Rangers," Mark said, badge glinting. "Weapons on the ground. Hands where I can see them. We can all go home without the bracelets if you keep this clean." For a breath, it looked like it might work. The oldest of the four, a broad man in a feed store cap, lifted his hands. His eyes flicked past Mark into the trees, where a second shadow had stopped moving. "Easy," the older man said to his crew. "We don't want trouble." The youngest laughed, high and mean. "Then why does trouble come dressed like Smokey the Bear?" He racked his bolt with a flourish. Mark's world narrowed to a barrel in a heartbeat. He took half a step toward the kid, not close enough to spook him, close enough to keep his focus. "Son," Mark said, steady as a flat lake, "you don't point that at anything you don't intend to destroy." "Maybe I intend," the kid said and swung the muzzle. Everything happened at once, always at once. Andrew moved fast, clean, the way Mark taught him, and the youngest flinched at the motion, snapping the barrel past Andrew's shoulder. The old man cursed. The cigarette man reached for a glove box. The scope tinkerer went still, eyes wide, calculating. Mark didn't think. He did what his body learned the hard way decades ago. He lunged, shoulders squared, and took the line of fire. The shot cracked the clearing. Light kicked off the truck chrome. Birds blew out of the canopy like black confetti. Impact punched Mark's side, hot and cold at once. He stumbled but stayed upright, teeth clenched against the white flare of pain. "Weapons down," he barked, voice iron. "Now." The old man ripped the rifle from the kid's hands and threw it at his feet. "You idiot." He spread his fingers wide to the sky. Hands, hands. Andrew was there, impossibly there, one arm bracing Mark as the other flicked his safety and leveled his own rifle, low non-lethal posture, but nobody here would mistake it for empty. "Down!" Andrew shouted. "On your knees, hands on your head." The men obeyed, even the mouthy kid. Shock moved through them like a slow wave, realizing what a gunshot meant when it hit person, not bark. Andrew's hands were on Mark, then off, then on again, a practice dance between triage and control. He forced Mark to a sit against the truck tire, slapped a pressure bandage from the kit onto Mark's side with a snap that bit the night. His headlamp clicked on. The beam found blood, found the slick line where a round had gouged through meat instead of shattering bone. Luck. Bad and good nested like snakes. "Stay with me," Andrew said, voice notched lower than Mark had ever heard it. Calm. Solid. The kind of voice that builds a bridge in a flood. "It's through and through lateral. I need 2 minutes. You can give me 2 minutes." Mark huffed a laugh that sounded like a cough. "Been giving minutes to fools all my life." Andrew's mouth twitched like it wanted to be a smile and thought better of it. He cinched the wrap tight, then tighter. Pain flared and cleared, leaving Mark strangely light. The radio on Mark's chest spat static and a clipped voice. "Unit 12, status." Andrew grabbed it. "Unit 12, officer wounded, conscious, stable. 4 suspects compliant. North boundary service spur off mile marker 53. Send sheriff and EMS. Copy?" "Copy. Unit 12. Hold scene. Help en route. 10 minutes. 10 minutes in the dark is a lifetime. Andrew patted Mark's shoulder, once a human thing, and turned to the 4 on their knees. He moved like a man twice his years and all of his training. Weapons were kicked aside, the truck placed in park, keys tossed onto the hood. He spoke to them like a teacher who still believed in tests. "Nobody moves. Nobody talks. We're going to do this right." The old man nodded, grief already heavy on his face. The kid's breath came in quick rabbit flickers. Cigarette man stared at the blood on Mark's shirt like it belonged to someone on TV. Then the night stretched thin and quiet, the way it sometimes does after metal meets flesh. Owls took back their roots. The truck ticked as it cooled. Somewhere, water fell trickling through rock like a long, slow clock. "What did you just do?" Mark muttered. "Kept you from bleeding," Andrew said, eyes on their perps. "Before that." Andrew didn't turn. "Stepped when you said step." Mark let that sit. Air moved in and out. The world narrowed again, but softer this time, to Andrew's outline in the sky beyond him, where the clouds tore open and a few stubborn stars stared down. "Kid," Mark said, and the word wobbled with more than blood loss. If that round had taken you— It didn't, Andrew said. I had a better angle. You know that. Mark closed his eyes. He saw a cradle in a blue room that doesn't exist anymore. He saw Emily's hands, sure and small, tying a bandage on a scraped knee, wrapping a gift tight, writing a note in tidy, square letters. He saw a porch where he had knelt and begged a door that never opened again. The old places in him gave way. He felt the dam he'd built out of work and silence and pine sap crack with a slow, inevitable sound. Andrew, he said, not kid. There's something if I don't— He swallowed. A thread of copper taste. I owe a truth. 2 of them, maybe. Andrew glanced over. The headlamp turned his eyes pale. Save your air. No. Mark's voice surprised him with how steady it was. Listen. He told it raw. No heroics, no excuses. He told him about the garage and the whiskey and the friend who wasn't, about the dawn and the shotgun and the road to the edge of town. He told him about the premature note on hospital paper he'd found too late, about the aunt's porch and the word forever slamming like a door, about the job in the trees that felt like the only sentence he could live with. He didn't say Emily's name until the end. When he did, it came out like a prayer and a sin. Emily. Andrew's jaw tightened just once. He put a hand on the truck fender and leaned into the cool metal like it anchored him. His voice, when it came, was careful enough to carry glass. What do you want me to do with that, Mark? Mark looked at him straight, the way you look at a man you'd choose in a flood. Find her, he said. Find her and find my son. Tell them I was wrong. Tell them I never stopped loving them, even when I was too proud to say it to a room with no one in it. Tell them. He ran out of words and breathed the dark. Tell them I have been sorry for 20 years. Andrew didn't answer. He turned back to the 4 shapes on their knees and the night around them and the long road of sirens coming closer. He stood there between past and present like a hinge, and Mark realized, too late, that the boy had shoulders built to carry other people's burdens. Red wash touched the trees first distant, then near, then spilling over bark and faces in the white of bandage wrap. The sheriff's cars bumped down the spur road, doors opening before the engines died. Voices replaced owls, clipboards replaced quiet. Hands took over that weren't Andrew's. Through and through, Andrew told the EMT, precise and clean. Left lateral. He stayed conscious, no shortness of breath. Vitals holding. You ride with us? The EMT asked. Andrew looked at Mark. You ride, Mark said. You started this shift. You finish it. Andrew almost argued. He didn't. He squeezed Mark's wrist once, hard. Then he stepped back and let the ambulance swallow him whole. Inside the rig, the lights were too bright and the air too cold and the smell too clean. Andrew sat on the bench, knees wide, hands linked, staring at the floor like it might spell something if he looked long enough. Mark watched him and let the drugs cool his blood and slow his world. Halfway to the hospital, the siren warbled for a corner and then steadied. Andrew leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He spoke to the floor and to Mark and to nobody. I promised someone, he said. Before the shot, before the sirens, I promised I'd carry his words. Mark blinked heavy. Good, he said, voice a gravel road. Keep your promises. Andrew lifted his head. His eyes were wet and fierce and young and ancient. I do, he said. I will. The ambulance took a left. Lights washed the ceiling blue, then red. Mark let go of the old breath he'd been holding since a morning 20 years ago, and let this one, finally, fill his lungs. Outside, the town slept. Inside, the past turned toward him at last. The hospital smelled like bleach and lemon polish, a sharpness that burned Mark's nose even through the fog of painkillers. He floated in and out of consciousness, voices coming and going like waves against rocks. Sometimes it was a doctor's clipped tone, sometimes the low murmur of nurses, sometimes Andrew's steadier baritone anchoring him to the surface. Then silence. When Mark opened his eyes fully, he thought for a heartbeat that he had died. Because she was there. Emily. Her hair was shorter, streaked with silver, her face lined in places he didn't remember. But her eyes, the same eyes that had undone him at 17, were staring right at him. He closed his eyes again, convinced the drugs were playing tricks. "Don't," a voice whispered. "Not a dream. Not an echo. Real. Don't close them. I'm not leaving." His chest heaved. He forced his eyes open, though tears blurred her shape. "Emily." His voice cracked on the name. I thought, I know," she said softly, stepping closer. Her hand hovered, then settled on his arm. Warm. Real. "I know what you thought." For the first time in 20 years, Mark Henderson broke. The man the town feared, the ranger who stood against rifles, the soldier who never flinched. He wept, raw and loud, like a boy begging for mercy. "I ruined everything," he choked. "I believed him. I sent you away. God, Emily, I threw you out with our baby in your arms. I've lived every day since with that gunshot in my head." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't pull away. "And I carried every day since with silence. I wanted to tell you. I wanted to scream it to the world. But you were gone. The man I loved was gone." He gripped her wrist weakly, as though afraid she'd vanish. "I searched. I swear I searched for you. Your aunt told me you left, and I couldn't—" His throat closed. "I couldn't find you." Emily's face softened. I know you tried." She glanced to the doorway. "He told me." Mark followed her eyes, and there, leaning against the frame, was Andrew. Not the student, not the trainee, not the stranger fate dropped on his porch. His son. Mark felt the truth hit him like another bullet, but this time it didn't wound, it seared and mended at once. His heart lurched against his ribs. His lips parted, but no words came. Andrew stepped in, his boots silent on the linoleum. He stopped at the foot of the bed, eyes steady, mouth tight. Then he spoke, low and even. "Hi. Dad?" The word cracked open everything Mark had been burying for decades. He reached out a trembling hand, but it faltered halfway. "Andrew," his voice shook. "It's you. All this time, it was you." Andrew's jaw worked like he was holding back more than words. Finally, he came closer, gripping Mark's hand firmly, grounding him. "I grew up hearing 2 stories," Andrew said. "One from Mom, that you were strong, that you loved hard, that you got lost, but maybe not forever. And one from everyone else, that you were the man who threw her out, the man who chose a bottle over a family." Mark flinched. His eyes begged. "And which did you believe?" Andrew's mouth curved in something between a smile and a grimace. "I didn't know what to believe. So I came here, to see for myself." Emily placed a hand on Andrew's shoulder. "He saved you, Mark. That night in the woods, he took the bullet so you wouldn't. You asked him to find me, to tell me your truth, and he did." Mark squeezed Andrew's hand, tears spilling unchecked. "I never stopped loving you, either of you. God, I was blind. Proud. Stupid." Andrew's eyes shimmered. "Then don't waste what's left. Stop being blind." Silence thickened the room, but it wasn't the silence of gossip or shame. It was the silence of a wound beginning to heal. For the first time in decades, Mark Henderson felt like a man with something left to live for. Hospitals had a way of stretching time until it lost all meaning. Days blurred into the same pattern, nurses checking vitals, doctors making quick notes, the steady beep of monitors, the hiss of oxygen Mark swore he didn't need. But this time, he didn't hate the waiting. Because Emily came every morning, and Andrew never left long enough for Mark to forget he was there. For 20 years, Mark had lived in silence. Now, every moment was filled with words that needed to be said. Emily sat by his bed the second night, the lamplight painting her face softer than the harsh fluorescence ever did. She was quiet, knitting something an old habit he remembered from winters long ago. Her hands still moved with the same calm rhythm, but her eyes carried decades of storms. "Why didn't you fight harder?" Mark asked suddenly, his voice raw. "When I threw you out, why didn't you scream? Why didn't you make me listen?" Emily paused, yarn wrapped around her fingers. Her eyes rose to his. Because you were holding a shotgun, Mark. Because you weren't the man I married in that moment. You were a stranger, and I had a baby in my arms. My only thought was keeping him safe. Mark shut his eyes, shame heavy as the bandages on his side. I would have never hurt him. Her voice softened, but it cut just as deep. You already had. Silence fell. The beeping monitor filled the space between them. Mark opened his eyes again and whispered, I don't deserve either of you. Emily studied him for a long time, then set her knitting down. You don't get to decide that. Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. Later, Andrew slipped in with 2 cups of bitter hospital coffee. He handed one to his mother, one to Mark. Don't spill it, Andrew said. Doctor said your stitches don't need caffeine burns. Mark managed a laugh. Strange, rusty, but real. You sound like her, he said, nodding at Emily. Andrew smirked. She'll tell you I get my stubborn streak from you. That made Mark choke on the coffee, eyes stinging. I don't even know what you like. Your favorite color, your birthday, I wasn't there. Andrew sat, leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Then ask me now. We've got time. So Mark did. He asked everything. About the school plays Andrew hated but performed in anyway. About the scar on his chin from falling off a bike. About the first girl who broke his heart. About how he decided to study forestry instead of business like everyone expected. Andrew answered each question carefully, sometimes with a smirk, sometimes with a shadow in his eyes. And slowly, the hollow places in Mark's chest began to fill, not with what he'd missed, but with the man his son had become anyway. On the 3rd night, the storm outside rattled the windows. Emily had gone home to rest, and Andrew dozed in the chair, his head tilted awkwardly against the wall. Mark lay awake, watching his son breathe. Andrew, he whispered. The young man stirred. Yeah? I thought I'd lost everything that night, and maybe I deserved to. But you stayed. You could have walked away when you found out who I was. Why didn't you? Andrew's eyes cleared of sleep. He leaned forward. Because Mom always said the truth is never just one story. I wanted to hear yours. Mark swallowed hard. And now that you have? Andrew's gaze didn't waver. Now I know the story isn't over yet. Mark felt tears rise again, but this time they didn't burn. They cooled him, washed him. Son, he said, the word trembling but true. Let me earn it back. Whatever's left of me, it's yours. I don't care if it takes the rest of my life. Andrew placed a steady hand on his arm. Then we'll start tomorrow, one day at a time. The doctors called his recovery remarkable for his age, but Mark knew the truth. He had something to live for now. Every step down the hallway with a walker wasn't just therapy. It was penance. Every breath wasn't just survival. It was a promise. When Emily returned one morning to find him standing at the window, weak but upright, she stopped short. He turned, breathless but grinning. Guess I'm not dead yet. Her lips twitched into the first real smile he'd seen on her in decades. You're too stubborn for death, Mark Henderson. He reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull away. By the end of the week, Mark was cleared for discharge. The ranger service had already called, asking about his return. But when the nurse wheeled him toward the exit, he looked at Emily and Andrew and said quietly, Home isn't a cabin in the woods anymore. It's wherever you are. Emily squeezed his shoulder. Andrew carried his bag. And for the first time in 20 years, Mark walked, or rather limped into the sunlight, not as a man sentenced to solitude, but as a man given a second chance. They released Mark on a Thursday when the mountains wore a clean, rinsed blue. The nurse insisted on a wheelchair. Mark insisted on his stubborn legs. Compromise looked like Andrew pushing an empty chair behind them, while Mark limped under his own power, Emily on his arm like a promise made visible. Outside, the air tasted like rain and asphalt. They didn't talk much on the drive. Emily watched the road. Andrew drove like a man with something worth losing. Mark counted mile markers the way he used to count years, since the porch door closed on him. At mile 53, he stopped counting. Cabin first, Emily said, then town. Town? Mark asked. We can't hide from it, she answered. Not again. He nodded. Courage isn't a roar. Sometimes it's a man saying, fine. The cabin looked smaller with 3 people in the doorway. Andrew set Mark's bag by the bed. Emily opened the windows, letting pine pour in. Dust motes lifted, spun, settled. The place felt like a held breath finally let go. Bathroom's still a one-man dance, Andrew said, measuring the tight space with his eyes. We'll fix that, Mark snorted. Since when do you say we about my house? Since 5 minutes ago, Andrew said and grinned. The word we rolled through the room and nested somewhere warm. They ate soup at the little table, elbows nearly touching. Emily moved like she'd never left this life finding spoons without asking, adjusting the kettle to the spot where it boils fastest. Andrew stepped outside after, returning with an armful of split pine like he'd lived here his whole life. Mark watched them both and felt the cabin reshape around the shape of them, like wood swelling after rain. By afternoon, Emily stood, smoothed her jeans, and said, All right, store. The last time Mark had walked into Hallie's General, he'd left with silence strapped to his back like a pack. Today, the bell over the door chimed and the room did what it always did. It went still. Conversations broke off. Eyes clicked to him, then to Emily, then to Andrew, who held the door until both of them were clear and let it swing shut. The checker with the copper hair, Hallie's daughter, all grown, now stood behind the counter. Her expression was not unkind, but it was wary, like a dog sniffing a hand that used to throw stones. Mark took off his hat. Afternoon. Afternoon, she echoed. Emily stepped up beside him, chin set. We need staples, coffee, flour, salt, and some of those lemon bars you hide under the counter. A laugh snuck out of the checker before she could stop it. Ma'am, there's no hiding them. People can smell butter at 50 yards. She slid a box out anyway. On the house. No, Mark said. We pay. All of it. His voice didn't carry the old iron. It carried something steadier. A man near the bait freezer cleared his throat. Heard the ambulance last week, he said without looking. Heard it was you. It was, Mark said. Heard a kid saved your hide. Mark glanced at Andrew. He did. The man nodded once, slow. Good kid. Another voice from the back, Mrs. Pike, who taught half the county to read and the other half to mind their business, said, Good mother, too. Emily lifted her eyes to her. Thank you, Mrs. Pike. Some tension eased, like a knot pulled an inch. Not undone, not yet, but looser. Hallie's daughter started scanning items. You know how it is, she said without looking at anyone in particular. Small townspeople tell the story they think makes the most sense to them. Sometimes it's the cruel one, sometimes it's the lazy one. She set the flour down gently. Sometimes you get a second draft. Her eyes flicked up to Mark. You gonna write one? Yes, Mark said, surprising himself with how fast it came. Starting now. He turned, faced the room. He didn't climb a crate or bang a jar. He just spoke, and the room let him. 20 years ago, I did something I've regretted every day since. I believed a lie because it hurt less than trusting the person I loved. I humiliated her. I sent her away with our newborn in her arms. That is on me. If you want to talk about a monster, talk about that man. I've been trying not to be him ever since. A fishing line on the rack trembled in the air conditioning. Somewhere, a child asked for candy and was shushed. Mark continued, voice lower. If any of you carried that story because I scared you, I'm sorry. If any of you tried to stop me and I scared you more, I'm sorry twice. I can't fix what I broke then, but I can stand here now and say this woman... He nodded at Emily. And this young man... He nodded at Andrew. Are my family. You don't have to like it, but you're going to see me act like it. No applause, no chorus of forgiveness. Just the small thud of truth landing on old floors and not breaking them. Mrs. Pike sniffed, dabbed her eye with a tissue she produced from nowhere, and said, About time. The bait freezer man grunted his version of a blessing. I always said Nick was a snake, he offered. At the name, the air shifted. Andrew's eyes cut to Mark. Emily's fingers tightened on the lemon bars. Hallie's daughter spoke carefully. He's still around, Lower Creek Road, works odd jobs, drinks even ones. Emily's jaw set. He told a lie that nearly killed us. And he gets to tell it again every time someone buys him a beer, Andrew added, not angry so much as precise. Stories with free refills last forever. Mark put his hat back on. Then we'll pour them out. They paid cash. On the way out, a teenage boy in a baseball cap held the door, eyes wide, as if he'd accidentally bumped into a living myth. Sir, he said to Mark, awkward and earnest, my dad says you taught him not to shoot at shadows. He says thanks. Mark nodded. Tell him he listened better than I did. Back at the cabin, they unpacked in silence that wasn't empty. Andrew stacked cans low where Mark wouldn't have to reach. Emily arranged the shelf with the habit of someone who needs order to hold back chaos. When the last bag was empty, she took a breath. I need to do one more thing, she said, if he's still where she used to be. The aunt, Mark said. It wasn't a question. Emily nodded. She deserves to hear it from us, not from town. I should go, Andrew said. No, Emily said, and then softened. Yes, but not inside. Wait on the porch. Andrew accepted the line like a boundary set on a map for good reasons. They drove the short road to the little white house with the tidy fence. The paint had blistered some, the porch swing groaned, but the geraniums were militant as ever bright, defiant, alive. The aunt opened the door and froze in the exact posture of someone bracing for a storm. Emily spoke first. Aunt June, please, just hear us. The older woman's eyes slid to Mark, narrowed to slits, then back to Emily. You look good, she said, betraying herself with that first mercy. I survived, Emily said, because of this one. She tipped her head toward the truck where Andrew pretended to check the tire pressure like it required a PhD. The aunt's eyes softened a shade. He's big. He's good, Emily said. They stood for a long breath on the threshold where so much had ended. Mark took his hat off and found words he hadn't earned yet. Ma'am, he said, I'm here to say I was wrong. I believed a drunk liar over the woman who'd never given me a reason to doubt. I frightened your niece. I endangered my child. I put you in a position to pick up pieces that weren't yours to pick up. I am sorry. For all of it. The aunt stared like she was reading tiny print on his soul. Then she stepped aside. Come in, she said. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it wasn't a closed door. They sat at a table that had seen more hard conversations than holiday pies. The aunt poured coffee that could strip paint. Emily talked first about leaving with a baby in a bag, about city buses and night shifts and community college classes during nap times, about the time Andrew got pneumonia and she slept on the hospital floor for 2 days because the chair squeaked and she didn't want to wake him. Mark listened like you listen to a church bell ringing your name. He didn't interrupt. When the aunt finally looked at him again, something in her gaze had shifted. He didn't drink after? She asked Emily. No, Emily said. Not more than anyone does when they're too tired to feel. He worked. He was angry at himself in a way I couldn't carry forever. So I put it down and carried our life instead. The aunt sniffed. You get that stubborn from me. I know, Emily said and smiled into her coffee. By the time the cups were empty, the aunt had asked Andrew in. She took one look at him, reached up, she was 5'0", and squeezed his face like he was 6. You look like your grandfather around the eyes, she declared, which was exactly the kind of history he'd come for. On the way back, sun burned through a thin veil of cloud, lighting the pines from within. They didn't talk until the cabin was in view. Then Andrew said, One more. Nick, Mark said. Nick, Emily echoed. They didn't drive to the Lower Creek Road that day. Some battles you plan with full bellies and clear heads. They chopped kindling. They made a stew Emily could do blindfolded. Andrew fixed the screen door that had squeaked since Reagan. The cabin settled again into a shape that could hold 3. As dusk braided itself through the trees, a truck crunched up the drive. Mark rose too fast. Pain flared. Andrew's hand was there before he fell back. The engine cut, a door groaned, boots on gravel. For a second, Mark thought the past had found them uninvited. Then the bait freezer man from the store rounded the porch. He held out a folded Sheet County letterhead like it weighed too much. Town council's calling a safety forum, he said, scratching the back of his neck. Hunting season coming. Folks get jumpy. Sheriff asked if you'd speak, Ranger, about not shooting at shadows, about telling the right stories. He glanced at Emily. Said he'd like the nurse from county to speak too. Different kind of safety. Emily's brows rose. You told him I'm a nurse? Town told him, the man said, shrugging. Turns out Mrs. Pike can't keep a secret when it's good. Mark took the paper. The event was in 3 days, at the high school gym. He felt the old fear crawl up his spine, the fear of rooms, of eyes, of the story everybody thinks they know. He looked at Andrew. You wanted a second draft, Andrew said. This is a printing press. Mark set the letter on the table like a challenge. All right, 3 days. They ate on the steps in the last of the light stew steam curling, spoons clinking, nightbirds starting their shifts. The forest exhaled. Somewhere far off, water moved over stone, patient as time. Tomorrow, Emily said, we drive the Lower Creek Road. Tomorrow, Mark agreed, not turning away from the dark that waited there. We end a story that should have died 20 years ago. Andrew leaned back, bare head against the doorframe, and for the first time since the shot, laughed full and surprised, like maybe the world could be big enough for all of this. The cabin kept the sound. The trees held it. The night didn't take it away. The next morning dawned crisp, the kind of morning where the pines glitter with dew and the air feels sharper than glass. Mark dressed slow, careful around the healing wound, but his jaw was set. Emily brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Andrew packed the truck with the quiet precision of a man going into battle. No one said the name, but they were all driving to the same place, Nick's house. The Lower Creek Road looked worse than Mark remembered. Trailers with peeling paint leaned against the slope. Rusted cars sat on cinder blocks. Beer cans lined the ditch like mile markers. At the end of the gravel, Nick's shack slouched against the woods, its roof sagging, its porch half-rotted. Nick himself was on that porch, beer in hand though the sun was barely up. His hair had thinned, his gut grown soft, but the smirk was the same, the one Mark remembered from the garage the night his life cracked open. Well, well, Nick called, voice thick with phlegm and drink. If it isn't the ghost and his angels. Andrew's hand twitched near the door handle, but Mark shook his head. Let me. He climbed out slow, pain sparking in his side, but not enough to stop him. Emily stood just behind, steady as a shadow. Andrew flanked her, arms crossed, eyes cold. Nick leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Heard you got yourself ventilated. Shame it wasn't deeper. He chuckled at his own joke. Mark didn't rise to it. He planted his boots at the base of the porch and said evenly, You and I are going to finish what you started 20 years ago. Nick barked a laugh. Started? You pulled the trigger on yourself, Henderson. I just lit the fuse. Don't blame me because you believed every word. Emily stepped forward then, voice sharp as a blade. You lied, Nick. You lied because I turned you down, because I made it clear I would never want you, and you cost us 20 years. For a flicker, Nick's smirk faltered, but he recovered, leaning back in his chair. So what? The town believed me. That's all that mattered. Andrew's voice cut in, low and steady. Not anymore. Nick glanced at him, sneering. And you must be the bastard boy. Guess the gossip wasn't wrong after all, huh? Andrew moved before he realized it. 2 steps up the porch, fists clenched. Mark's voice cracked through the air. Andrew, stand down. Andrew froze, chest heaving. Nick grinned wider, mistaking restraint for weakness. Mark took another step closer. Listen to me, Nick. I spent 2 decades carrying your lie like a cross. I lost my wife. I lost my son. I lost myself. That's on me. I let your poison in. But today it ends. You don't get to tell this story anymore. Nick's smirk slipped again. His eyes darted to Emily, then to Andrew, then back to Mark. For the first time, a hint of fear cracked through the booze haze. You think anyone cares what you say now? Nick muttered. Emily's voice rose, clear and steady. We care, and that's enough. Andrew stepped up beside her, tall, unshaken. And the town will hear the truth from us, not from you. Friday night, community forum. Be there if you've got the guts. Nick scoffed, drained the rest of his beer, and waved them off with a shaking hand. Go on then, rewrite your fairy tale. Nobody'll buy it. But as they turned back to the truck, Mark heard the tremor in his voice. The ride back was silent until Emily spoke. He'll never admit it. Men like that don't. Mark nodded. He doesn't have to. All he has to do is fade. Andrew glanced at him in the rearview mirror. And if he shows up Friday? Then the town will see him for what he is, Mark said. Not because I say it, because he can't help himself. That evening, Mark sat at the cabin table with a yellow legal pad. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but the words came. Emily read them aloud when his hand cramped. Andrew added notes where the speech faltered. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't polished, it was raw truth. I was a fool. I was cruel. I was wrong. And I am sorry. Those lines stayed. They didn't need editing. By the time the lamp guttered low, the three of them sat in tired silence, but it wasn't heavy. It was the silence of work well done, of wounds being stitched from the inside out. Outside, the forest whispered like it always had. But for the first time in decades, Mark felt it wasn't whispering against him. It was whispering with him. Friday was coming. The gym. The crowd. The second draft of a story he should have never let anyone else write. And this time, he wouldn't be alone on that stage. The high school gym hadn't changed much since Mark last set foot in it. The same faded banners for basketball championships from the 90s. The same squeak of old bleachers. The same echo that made every cough, every shuffle, every whisper sound louder than it should. By 7 o'clock, the place was packed. Hunters in flannel, mothers with kids balanced on their laps, old-timers with arms crossed like judges. The sheriff stood near the stage, hat tucked under his arm, scanning the crowd. Mrs. Pike sat in the front row, tissue already in hand. Mark sat off stage, hands folded on his knees, hat in his lap. His stomach felt like it had swallowed barbed wire. Emily sat beside him, calm but tight-lipped, her hand occasionally brushing his like an anchor. Andrew paced, glancing at the clock, at the crowd, at the door. Because that was the question, wasn't it? Would Nick show? The sheriff called the meeting to order. He talked about safety, about poaching, about community. Then he gestured to Emily. She walked to the podium with the same grace she had carried as a 19-year-old bride. She spoke about first aid in the woods, about how minutes mattered, about keeping each other alive long enough to see another dawn. She didn't mention the past, not directly, but her steady voice carried authority. People listened. Then the sheriff turned to Mark. The gym seemed to hold its breath. He rose, slow but steady, his side aching with every step. He placed his hat on the podium, gripped the edges, and let the silence stretch until it was just shy of breaking. "My name's Mark Henderson," he began. His voice was gravel but steady. "Some of you know me as the ranger who'll check your tags. Some of you know me as the man who walks into the store and leaves it quieter than he found it. And some of you..." He let his eyes scan the room. "Know me as a story you've told for 20 years. A ripple moved through the crowd. No one left. No one coughed. "That story says I threw my wife and child out because she cheated. That story says I raised my gun and chose my pride over my family. That story..." His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "Was born of a lie, and I believed it. That's the part I own. I believed a man who wanted what I had, and I let his poison turn me against the only people who ever loved me, without fear." Emily's eyes glistened in the front row. Andrew's jaw was set, his shoulders straight. "I won't stand here and tell you I was innocent," Mark continued. "I wasn't. I was angry. I was proud. I was cruel. And I was wrong. Dead wrong. If you want to remember me as the fool who ruined his own life, fine. But remember this too. I've carried that regret every day since. And I will until I'm in the ground." A cough came from the back, sharp, mocking, heads turned. Nick. He leaned against the bleachers, arms crossed, beer on his breath even from 20 feet away. "Funny how a man finds his conscience when he's shot in the gut," he called out. "You all gonna clap now? You all gonna forget he chased his wife out with a shotgun?" The gym buzzed. Some looked down, some glared, some nodded, uncertain. Mark didn't flinch. He fixed his eyes on Nick. "I don't expect anyone to forget, least of all her. least of all my son. He gestured to Andrew. Gasps rose as realization spread like wildfire. That's right. The young ranger who stood with me in the woods last week is Andrew, my son, the child I should have protected, the man I don't deserve but got anyway. Andrew stepped forward, standing tall beside his father. I grew up with two stories, he said, voice carrying like a bell. One that said my dad was a coward who broke his family, and one that said he was a good man who lost his way. Tonight, I choose the second story, because I've seen the man he is now. Murmurs rippled. The sheriff cleared his throat. You got something to add, Nick? Nick sneered, but his eyes darted around. The room wasn't with him this time. Whispers hissed. Snake, liar, drunk. Emily stood then, calm as stone. He told the lie, but Mark lived it, and we all paid the price. Tonight isn't about him. It's about whether this town lets go of the poison it's been drinking for 2 decades. Silence. Then Mrs. Pike, voice cracking with age but strong, said, I believe her. Others echoed. One by one, heads nodded. Nick muttered something and pushed off the wall, stumbling toward the door. No one stopped him. No one followed. The story had left him behind. Mark turned back to the crowd. I can't undo what I did. But I can stand here and tell you this. I will spend what years I have left protecting this forest, protecting this town, and protecting the family I nearly destroyed. If you can accept that, then maybe we can write something better together. For a long moment, the gym was still. Then hands clapped. Not all of them, not loud, but enough. Enough to echo off the banners, enough to mean something. Mark stepped down, Emily's hand finding his, Andrew at his side, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a man walking out of judgment. He felt like a man walking into a future. Autumn came early that year. The aspens blazed gold against the pines, and the mornings carried frost that smoked when the sun touched it. For the first time in decades, Mark didn't dread the change of season. The cabin had been patched, cleaned, warmed with more than firewood. Emily's laughter filled corners that once only heard silence. Andrew's boots by the door made the place look lived in, not haunted. The town had shifted, too. Not everyone forgave small towns never forget entirely, but the story had cracked open. People nodded at Mark now, not with fear, but with something closer to cautious respect. The checker at the store put an extra lemon bar in the bag without a word. The sheriff stopped by for coffee, not business. Even the bait freezer man brought venison one afternoon, saying only, for the stew. Nick had slipped out of town weeks after the meeting, leaving behind debts and an empty shack. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. One evening, the three of them sat on the porch, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands. The forest hummed with crickets, the sky bruised purple with stars pressing through. I used to sit here alone, Mark said quietly. Count the trees, count the regrets. Thought I'd die with both. Never thought I'd sit here with you. Emily leaned back in the rocker, blanket around her shoulders. Life doesn't give back what it takes, Mark, but sometimes it gives something new, if you're willing to take it. Andrew tapped his mug, thinking. It's like the forest. A fire comes through, burns everything down. Looks like it's over. But give it time, and new growth pushes through the ash. Mark turned, studied his son, the man he'd missed raising, the man he now had to learn. Pride swelled in him, heavy and light at once. Guess I've got a lot of planning to do. Andrew smirked. Good thing you've got help. That winter, the three of them cut wood together. Snow piling on the eaves, the fire inside burning bright. They argued about how much salt went in stew, who stacked wood straighter, who snored loudest. Ordinary arguments, the kind that meant life. Sometimes, late at night, Mark still woke in a sweat, shotgun echo in his ears, Emily's face in the doorway. But now, when he turned, Emily was there for real, her hand finding his. It's over, she'd whisper. And for the first time, he believed her. Spring came, wildflowers painting the meadows. Andrew packed for college, for a future that stretched far but always circled back to the mountains. On his last night before leaving, he stood with Mark at the tree line. You sure you'll be all right? Andrew asked. Mark chuckled. I've survived worse than an empty cabin. Not empty, Andrew corrected. Not anymore. Mark's throat tightened. He pulled his son into a rough hug, the kind men give when words fail. You carry your mother's heart, he said. But you've got my stubborn. Use both. Andrew grinned. That's the plan. Months later, on a quiet evening, Mark walked the ridge alone. The forest breathed around him, alive, endless. He paused, hand on a pine trunk, and spoke into the silence. Emily, Andrew, I don't know how many years I've got left, but they're yours, every last one. A breeze stirred, carrying the smell of rain and pine. For once, it didn't feel like the forest was whispering against him. It felt like it was whispering with him. He tipped his hat, turned back toward the cabin glowing warm in the twilight. And for the first time in 20 years, Mark Henderson walked home,